I want to thank Town Hall so much for hosting this, and I want to thank my family. Came up from Portland, old friends. This is turning into a little bit of an Evergreen State College reunion from an era that I won't tell you exactly, but I want to thank my friends for coming, my family for coming, and those of you who don't know me. It makes me feel I'm feeling very at home and welcome in Seattle at the moment. And of course, Seattle is the first place, SeaTac, first place in the country to pass the $15 wage, so it seems like it's a very appropriate homecoming in that sense as well. So I want to very quickly introduce the book and the frame, and then hopefully then Heidi will come up and we'll have a conversation. The title came from a conversation that I had with a Fight for 15 Alliance in Tampa, Florida, and it was an interesting group of people because it was fast food workers, it was home health care workers who couldn't be there in person. They Skyped in because they work so many hours a week, given the fragility of their clients and their commitment to care, and it was college professors, adjuncts, and also graduate students. And so I asked them how they came to find each other. And Keegan Shepard, this graduate student, said, they tell us if we try to, if we're quiet, our advanced degrees will get us great jobs and we will fit right into the path to the American dream. He said, but the truth is, that's a lie to keep us quiet because we're all fast food workers now. And then, how did they define that? They define themselves as members of the precariat, right? The new working class, the precariat being people who do not have job security, right? Do not have pensions, do not have benefits, do not have real chances of mobility. In the movement, they don't use the word precariat, they use the word McJobs. And they say that McJobs, as this young man, Blue Rainier, put it, the American dream is broken. And almost everybody who is working at a job that doesn't fully support them and does not offer them mobility. And when Keegan Shepard said, we're all fast food workers now, Blue, who is a fast food worker, responded, perhaps we are all adjunct professors. It is one and the same, and the professors in the coalition figured out they got about the same amount as fast food workers. There's another thing that this book is about, and that is going backwards in time. It got its start also in 2011 when I was organizing with many other people the 100th anniversary commemoration of the Triangle Factory Fire in New York, where 146 young workers died, and galvanized a new consensus about the need to regulate workplace safety, in part because those who died were young and they died in front of a crowd of thousands in the middle of New York City on a warm spring afternoon. The narrative since then had been, those were the bad old days, everything's gotten better, we have labor laws now, we have strong unions, and every annual commemoration would say we must keep vigilant, but because we don't want to go back to those bad old days. We brought this person to New York, Kalpona actor, 37 years old, then the leader of a vibrant garment workers movement in Bangladesh. And what she did when she walked on the stage of the Great Hall of the People in Cooper Union, New York, was where the greatest women's strike in U.S. history had started 100 years earlier, and many of those women would die in Triangle 2 years later. She got up and she said, in Bangladesh, it's not 2011, it's 1911. And what I found in the course of writing this book is that that's not just true in Bangladesh. It's true in Providence, Rhode Island. It's true in Los Angeles. It's true in Seattle. We do have laws to protect workers now, but they're often observed in the breach, in part because we're all fast food workers. Everybody's a contract worker. People aren't protected by those laws. They're not entitled to those protections. And then the final thing that I want to say in terms of a theme of this book, and then we can go back, and hopefully Heidi can come up and we'll talk. These are hotel housekeepers. In Phnom Penh, Cambodia, they're part of a global uprising of hotel housekeepers that, along with garment workers, along with fast food workers, along with farm workers, has begun to change the way we think about labor around the world. And what these folks have made clear to me is that hotel housekeepers exemplify one of the big problems of the modern labor movement, which is that low-wage labor is invisible, right? We don't see it. the organizer of this global campaign by hotel housekeepers, Massimo Frattini, this former Milan baggage carrier who now sits in this little office in Geneva working a million phones and organizing global actions, he said to me, you know, everybody checks out of the hotel room, leaves your hotel room in the morning, comes back in the afternoon, and it's, wow, it's like a fairy made it perfect. He said, to make people see that it's a human being is the first step of this struggle. And so those are the themes that I want to talk about: how everybody became fast food workers, how we've gone back 100 years in time, how making the invisible visible is at the core of this current labor struggle. And just some photographs by my brilliant collaborator, Liz Cook. And you'll see them if you, and another evergreener, of course, known by many in this room. To give you a sense of the images of the folks who we talked to in this struggle: home health care workers, fast food workers. One of the things this movement does is brilliantly subvert expensive ad slogans. We're not loving it. The Walmart's pay less, live better became stand up, live better. And the final piece, and then I hope then Heidi, you should come up, is very young people involved in this revolution, and from Manila to Seattle, to New York, to South Africa, a new kind of musical protest form is taking hold, and that is singing, dancing flash mobs have become the way that new strikes are organized. And this guy helped to choreograph a singing, dancing flash mob in 2014 that brought fast food workers out all across the vast city of Manila with its 23 million people. It was basically a singing, dancing conga line of 16-year-old girls making up their own lyrics to the theme song from Disney's Frozen, Let It Go. So I want you to imagine this very, very different kind of movement. Okay, airport workers flooding into unions. These two women led the first strike against the Walmart in the United States in Pico Rivera, California in 2012. Another movement that spread across the United States. Homeless employed workers. Another theme of this book that, you know, you can have a job and it doesn't mean you can support yourself. The question is not what the unemployment statistics are, but you have to have 3 jobs to live. She'd been living in that car for 2 years. Housekeepers in Phnom Penh, part of the same struggle. The garment workers movement. It's a feminist uprising. These are the leaders of the United Sisterhood Alliance, which is organizing feminist consciousness-raising groups among garment workers, as well as organizing unions all over Cambodia, Philippines, and finally, some of the farm workers who are building a transnational network of indigenous farm workers using indigenous people's transnational connections and family ties to form unions from, and you guys probably were aware of the Sakuma blueberry strike, from, you know, northern Washington all the way down into Baja California, where 50,000 people walked out of the berry fields and struck in the spring of 2015, successfully raising their wages. Undocumented immigrants fighting back. Bernardino Martinez fought tasering in the fields, which was going on not in the Philippines, not in Cambodia, but in Oxnard, California, when people tried to organize. And this is also a story of dispossession from lands and the great crisis that we now face. So many land grabs since 2008. That small farmers, farm workers being pushed off their land all around the world. They have flooded to the cities, you know, not only in the United States, obviously, but all around the world, and have become the labor force, the cheap labor force for these new global industries. Global agribusiness, global garment work, global hotel work, global construction work. So yeah, that is a very, very quick summary of what goes on in this book. Photographs by Liz Cook, and there we go. All right, let's open it up to Heidi. Thank you for agreeing to be up here and talking with me.
Excited. Thanks for coming. So I want to start with a couple of sort of general things and then get into some of the specific worker stories in the book. But first of all, you know, why did you choose to take such a global approach to this issue? Why should we be thinking beyond Seattle and, you know, beyond even the United States?
Well, because one thing Blue Rainier found as a fast food worker from Tampa who hadn't thought globally, when he was invited to Brazil in the summer of 2015 for a global convening of fast food workers, was that they're working for the same corporation. McDonald's is the second largest employer in the world. So a McDonald's worker in Seattle is tied to McDonald's workers in Manila and to McDonald's workers in Seoul. And he met a McDonald's worker from Japan, one from Seoul, one from Manila, and they rolled up their sleeves, and that's what he's showing there. And they all had burns in exactly the same places, because they were asked to perform labor into the same work regime, right? And so he said it became clear to me what a global labor force meant. And so, McDonald's, second largest private employer in the world. Walmart is the first largest. The only employers larger than Walmart are the U.S. military and the Chinese military, right? So, we're looking at regimes that are the new colonialism, and they're more powerful than most governments. And that's why I think it's imperative to look globally.
And you also started working on the book before Donald Trump was elected president, is that right?
Yes.
So how did that manifest or change the work that you were doing?
I think these activists really made me see doubly, triply, quadruply how important it is, for all of us, for how important it was for me to get out of my fetal position on the floor, and to think about what kinds of actions we could take. And, abroad, there were workers in the Philippines and in Cambodia and in Bangladesh dealing with brutal dictatorial regimes, and the possibility of losing their lives. I interviewed 20-somethings who said to me in so many words, I could die doing this. I know that. That's okay. That's really okay if I can make things better. Cambodians who said, we're entitled to a real democracy after the Khmer Rouge. So on the one hand, it made me feel like our grief in this country is too inward looking, and we need to understand and make solidarity with people abroad. But even in this country, I interviewed a young activist in Las Vegas, 21-year-old named Stretch Sanders, who's a homeless activist, and started having conversations about homelessness in Seattle before this event. And what he said was all these problems were there. They're deeper than Trump. They were there before Trump. And he said, police violence, you'll notice Blue's wearing an I Can't Breathe sweatshirt, which was those were the last words of Eric Garner, the cigarette vendor who was killed in Staten Island by the police in the summer of 2014. And so Stretch said, my brothers and sisters were already being shot down in the streets. My coworkers were already getting the knock on the door at 5 a.m. and parents were being dragged away from children, not knowing where their parents were going to go. He said, so got work to do. We had work to do before the election, and we still do.
And he or maybe another activist says, we're the same people. The people being affected by these low-wage jobs are the same people subject to police violence.
Yeah.
So maybe there's already an infrastructure for the activism there.
Yeah, during the summer, the uprisings and riots after Michael Brown was shot, the place where activists and also rioters and the community took refuge was in a McDonald's, which was an epicenter of Fight for 15 activism in the St. Louis area.
So you talked earlier about the precariat. Do you think this is an old or, is this a new idea or simply a revisiting of an old situation?
I mean, I think a lot of people, have claimed credit for coining that term, and I think it's one that's been in the making for a while. Is it a new concept? No, I don't think it's a completely new concept, but the extent to which workers in this country as well as abroad are working without the status of being an employee, right? In this kind of temporary status, everybody's freelancing, everybody's an entrepreneur, which means you don't have benefits, right? And you don't have overtime pay, and you don't have pensions, you don't have protections from bad conditions. So I think that is worse than it was. As I was writing this book, I kept thinking that this had happened in my adult lifetime, right? That in the past 30 or 40 years, the world had changed in some profound ways, and I think the rise of the precariat is one of them. And the rising of the precariat is another. That's as much what this book is about as the situation that created so much instability in people's lives and work.
Mm-hmm. And in writing about, that everybody's freelancing sort of idea, you say precarious workers are not plucky free agents creatively making their way in the gig economy. They are victims of what should be considered a vast criminal conspiracy. So talk a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Okay, so I was riding the subway in New York not too long ago, and the whole subway car inside was plastered with these images for a company named Fiverr. And the one of them that I really paid attention, that I took a picture of because I want to start using it in these talks, is nice, kind of young, the young hip New York woman of color, right? She's got a hijab, she's also got a black leather jacket, and the headline on this picture is, "Nothing crushes the soul like a steady paycheck." Or nothing so soul-crushing as a steady paycheck. And I thought, wow, what are you selling? And fortunately, since it's New York, someone sent me a picture a few weeks later of how all these subway cars were tagged with, yeah, you want a better, stop having your soul crushed, join a union, work together, organize. But that's the image of the gig economy. We choose it, right? We're freer that way. We don't work for the man. And I think, in the reality, what's going on is wage theft, right? That people, was talking to, my nephew who worked in restaurants, and I worked in restaurants, and probably many people in this room have, all those hours that are called, what's it called? Charity work, gift labor, or, chore labor, all the ways in which, you do work and you don't get paid for it. So yeah, I think the gig economy is a nice way of talking about something that is making people really hard-pressed.
Mm-hmm. Are there any lessons from the fast food workers or the garment workers that you think gig economy workers, Uber drivers or tech workers, Amazon workers should be really heeding?
Well, I think what's starting to happen, and in many of the places that I did interviews, in Bangladesh, where there's been a huge movement among the garment workers, in Cambodia too, in the Philippines, the fast food workers organizing here too, that the only way to get around not being covered by labor laws is to unionize. And by the way, just as I came in here, when I talked in Portland, the workers who are trying to unionize the Burgerville chain came, and they were all excited, and they wrote me and they said, please announce in Seattle tonight that we won our next union vote, right? They just unionized another store today. So, and these are young people, they're kids, right? But they are talking about the need to go back to this old-fashioned model, because the gig economy is an end run around the New Deal, right? All those laws we thought we passed 80 years ago are not protecting people anymore, and so unions are the only thing that will.
So you mentioned Bangladesh and the garment workers. I feel like their stories were some of the worst, most egregious in the book. And one that stuck with me is that some of them are dealing with hunger in such a severe way that it might be causing ghost sightings among workers. And so they're now advocating, instead of for a certain wage per hour, for enough money for a certain number of calories. How did they come to the decision that that would be a more effective way of organizing, and is it working for them?
Well, because what Kalpona actors said to me is that, we can argue about what a living wage is, but everybody knows how many calories it takes to live healthfully, right? There's no argument about that. And so they began to talk about that. And the ghost sightings, of course, are from hunger. People faint. What's been happening is this rash of faintings in garment factory bathrooms, and when people wake up, they say they've seen a ghost. Well, it's also an environment in which there have been 100 triangle fires. Right, our clothes are being made under killing conditions, and so people have PTSD. They have experience with loss. Almost everybody's been touched by loss, and of course the terrible Rana Plaza factory collapse, where in 2013, right, where 1,200 workers died and 2,500 were grievously injured, bones crushed and being kept under the rubble for 3 days. And they're horrible, horrible stories. And so they're organizing around all of it, but they felt like hunger strikes, by the way, are happening in the United States too, where workers are hungry, right? The Walmart workers told me one of the reasons they use hunger strikes, the hotel workers said the same thing, is because they're hungry anyway. Right? Hunger is a major issue in the United States today, not just not just in Bangladesh, not just in Cambodia. So hunger strikes are the weapon of choice across these movements that I studied.
And what types of victories are those garment workers winning?
Everyone's winning. I mean, the situation is terrible, and maybe when we open it up, some friends in the audience who said they couldn't be quite as optimistic as I am.
I felt the same.
Might speak up. That's my job. I've been called the stand-up and cheer historian, and so I try to live up to my name. But there've been tremendous victories. You know, in the United States, $61.5 billion in wage increases won by the low-wage workers movement between 2012 and 2016. That's a lot of money. It's 12 times what Congress gave the last time they raised the minimum wage. For these garment workers in Bangladesh, they raised their wages by 25 times. And the biggest success is the Bangladesh Fire and Safety Accord, which targeted the top of the supply chain, targeted H&M, it targeted all the big global companies, and got them to sign an agreement saying they would pay more to their suppliers so that the wages could be raised for workers. And Bangladeshi workers have increased their wages by 25 times since the 1980s. So it's a very dramatic set of victories. But they also agreed to pay for factory inspections by inspectors chosen by the workers. One of the things about fast fashion is that, you know, you all saw it. It came in, it flooded into our stores. Suddenly the world was full of great $10 shirts, $10 skirts, $5 shirts. That vastly expanded the industry from 20 million in 2000 to 75 million now working, making clothes. And what's amazing is that in Bangladesh, since this accord was signed, they went from an average of 200 workers a year dying making our clothes to none, right? So that's a fairly, you know, even if not every single, you know, victory was due to the Bangladesh Fire and Safety Accord, those numbers are so stark, it's hard to argue.
Mm-hmm. And garment workers, I think in several countries who you talk to, also use this tactic of collecting the tags off the floors of the factories. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Workers these days don't know who they work for. So everyone, because the global supply chains are so complicated and fragmented, that for garment workers, these companies intentionally hide, you know, they hide themselves. So Kalpana Akhtar in the book tells a horrendous story of walking into the still smoking rubble of the Tazreen factory fire, which was a fire very much like Triangle in 2012. People jumping from windows, you know, families coming to try to identify the bodies of loved ones in the streets. She went into the still smoking ruins and she was determined to find the Walmart invoices or the label. She knew they were there, and ultimately she did. She did the same thing after the Rana Plaza collapse, and what she found were labels for the children's place, said made with love, right? Made with love in Bangladesh. And then she and the survivors of those disasters held the corporations accountable. And they came to the United States and they took, you know, they protested and they stood in front of those corporate headquarters until those companies agreed to pay reparations, to pay for people who were permanently injured, to pay some kind of stipend for them. But this was a very, very hard battle. It's the same in the berry fields, right? Driscoll's has all these millions of little partners, so you can pretend that it's not Driscoll's. It's same in the hotel industry. It's basically an investment, you know, issue now. People don't. One Hilton is not like the other, right? One Starwood is not like the other. They're all owned by investors who take their money in and out really quickly. So that's a big job for workers, is finding out who they work for. And once they find out who they work for, then they go to look for their code of conduct. And then they say, okay, this is in your code of conduct. You're not living up to it. We're going to try to embarrass you into doing that. And they know, I mean, these big corporations, what kind of power do they have? The only kind of power they have is we're not loving it, right? To mess with the brand, to do things that make the companies look bad. And as a result, there's been a lot of movement in companies in all of these different fields.
And also sometimes to get maybe higher profile people associated with the brand on the side of the workers, like models in one of these cases, right? It's this sort of cross-class solidarity.
Yeah, very much. Kalpana Akhtar led a models protest at Lincoln Center in New York City when the Nautica sportswear line was being launched during Fashion Week, just shortly after the Rana Plaza collapse. And it was great because the models, they were the faces of Nautica Sportswear. They were the faces of a lot of these lines, and that were being launched that year. So obviously it got press, and the models were great. They said, we feel like we have a responsibility. We sell these clothes, right? We have a responsibility to the women who make them to make sure people understand that they don't have to be made in under killing conditions.
So something that I think is really striking about the book, and you mentioned it in the intro, is a lot of these industries are dominated by women. Yeah. Not just the garment workers, but you write about Cambodian beer girls, yeah. Hotel workers, of course, vineyards in South Africa, where the media referred to the movement as sort of leaderless, when in fact, of course, it was women leading the movement, but yeah. It's easy to ignore. And I think we're seeing it recently with the teacher strikes also. And so I guess I'm wondering, as you were doing the research in this book, how at the forefront was the fact that this is clearly a feminist struggle, or is it sort of an afterthought for the workers?
No, it was very much at the forefront. Here, let's see if I can get back to the woman who uttered this line. Yeah, there she is. So this is a 27-year-old fast food worker, Sister Nice Carnation, that's her nom de guerre. And, she said to me, you can't dismantle capitalism without dismantling patriarchy. And she was very serious, right? This was her idea. She was going to do it. And there are many reasons for it. You have these folks expressly talking about reproductive justice, about helping women not conceive when they don't want to, about fighting domestic violence. The South African grape pickers, you literally had to take an oath when you joined their union that you would be a warrior against domestic violence and sexual violence against women wherever you found it. And they would literally have, little brigades from the union that would come into a house where a woman was being beaten, or come into a field where the employer was known to, the overseer was known to beat the women workers. Pregnancy discrimination, sexual violence, inequity in wages based on sex, all of those things, and consciousness raising groups, very much like we've had here 40 years ago when we were at Evergreen. I think those kinds of things are very, very visible, and they, in terms of the global actions, November 25th, you probably don't know it, but women workers around the world do. It's the global day of action to fight gender-based violence, and they're looking for a UN, some kind of UN legislation, agreement. They're looking for an International Labor Organization convention, zero tolerance for gender-based violence. So it's very expressly, I think, a new wave of global feminism.
Mm-hmm. What about labor movements in the United States? Do you think they're doing enough to combat, sexual violence on the job or other gender-based violence?
Yeah, so Chicago housekeepers launched a hands-off, pants-on campaign because 3/4 of hotel housekeepers have faced sexual assault threats or sexual harassment severe enough that they feared for their safety. So in the United States as well, Unite Here has been, one of the most outspoken on issues of sexual violence, but of course also the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, the tomato workers who pioneered this idea of these agreements that target the top of the supply chain, like the Bangladesh Accord, like their own Fair Food Accord. They were just in New York a few days ago, hunger striking in front of Wendy's because Wendy's has not signed on to a zero tolerance for sexual violence in the fields. So I think the battle is being joined here. Are unions doing enough? No, but are they engaged in it? Absolutely, and the workers are pushing them in that direction. The Chicago workers are fierce on this issue, as are the field workers.
Mm-hmm. And what about since the book and since you finished the book and the Me Too movement sort of picked up, are you hearing from workers? Is it inspiring some new movements, or are they we've been working on this forever and no one listened?
Both. On the one hand, it's, they think it's kind of funny that, there are a few well-known faces in Hollywood, begin to talk about this thing that they've been talking about for many years. On the other hand, any help is gratefully accepted. Anything that shines a spotlight on the issues that they care about, is something that they're grateful for. So they're not sarcastic about the Me Too movement in any way. They just feel like it lends power to what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. So there's been a critique that I'm sure you're familiar with of Fight for 15 and some of these other movements that, they're not necessarily drawing people into unions, or they're not even giving workers unions. While they may get them a raise, they're not getting them a union. And I've heard people here in Seattle say, that's kind of ceding some ground, right? Or it's giving up on the idea that we can bring unions back in some way. What do you make of that critique?
I mean, the critique is fair, but what LaFonza Butler, who is the president of the California Home Health and Hospital Workers Union, I think it's the largest union local in the country, said to me is the reputation of unions was so bad all across the United States that the first thing they needed to do was to get people to feel like unions fight for all workers. Right, and there's a campaign for all workers, not just those who are their members. So that's one element of it. But we've started to see an influx into unions, and that's why I think the Burgerville campaign in Portland is important. But I think we're starting to see. I wanted to show you these guys. Prince Jackson and Canute Drayton, who are airport workers from Queens and Brooklyn, respectively, who shortly after I first interviewed them in 2015 launched the union drive in Kennedy, LaGuardia, and Newark. By 2016, they had brought in 8,000 workers into unions in those three airports, and LAX signed at the same time, Minneapolis, St. Paul, airport unionized. So there are workers coming back into unions. I think the high-profile cases have been like the auto plants that did not unionize in the South. Tremendous pressure, tremendous harassment. I think one of the things that unions are trying to do is to try to make it a less frightening environment. So I showed you Bernardino Martinez. He was an organizer for the United Farm Workers, trying to get the new wave of indigenous berry pickers into the union. I mean, and people are being tased. Right, they're being spied on. There are recordings going on in their living quarters. Many of these workers are undocumented. They're frightened, and yet even so, right, you have the union that formed in Sakuma Berry in Washington State, and you have their sister union in Baja California. So, I think unions we're seeing new kinds of unions. We're getting people flooding in. Despite the fact that it's a slow process. I mean, unions had been largely eviscerated, except for public sector unions, since the 1970s.
Yeah, and we may be on the verge of those being eviscerated as well.
The Janus decision.
And when you talk to workers like that who are facing that kind of intimidation, like, what do they say motivates them to overcome that much intimidation and fear?
They're mad. I mean, Bernardino Martinez was furious. He's like, you already tasered me. Right? You already tasered me. You already knocked me out with your electrical current. What else can you do to me? Right? And so one of the stories that people have responded to in this book is the story of Santa Brito, a hotel housekeeper who got pregnant while she was on the job. She had no time off because, like most non-union workers in the country, she was not entitled to maternity leave or even sick leave, and they wouldn't even give her unpaid leave. So she went into labor while making a bed, and she asked her supervisor if she could leave the shift early, and the supervisor said no. And eventually her water broke, while she was making a bed. And one of the big issues for hotel housekeepers is toxics. They want the right to refuse to work with toxic cleansers. So her water broke, and she said, I don't care anymore, and she walked off the job and went to the hospital in her uniform. Right? She said, I just took time to wash the toxics off my hands before I gave birth. And then, you know this story, 2 weeks later, she's called and fired for leaving her shift early. And she said, what do I have to lose? You made me a unionist. And she did successfully organize her hotel. The Renaissance in Providence became a union hotel 2 years later because, she wouldn't stop. So a lot of these workers keep saying, I have nothing to lose. I have nothing to lose. In this new deportation regime, that's not as true as it was. People don't want to be taken away from their kids. But even so, I've been struck. The Vermont dairy workers are refusing to hide, even though they're all undocumented. So I'm just struck again and again by people's bravery.
So here in Seattle, we've seen a lot of new worker protections, of course, not just the wage, but also secure scheduling and hotel workers initiative of our own. But the city has not done such a great job with enforcement of all of these laws. And so did any particular lesson stand out to you in terms of once these protections are won, how we can ensure that government at any level is enforcing them?
Only the workers ensure that, and that's our history, right? If you go to the New Deal era, once those laws were passed, they were only enforced when workers struck and when workers insisted that they be enforced. And in the Philippines, fast food workers just won a big victory, which was that the federal Department of Labor required that all employers, once you've been working more than 4 months, call you an employee and you're covered by all labor laws. But when I heard from from the people that I'm friends with there now, and they said, now the work begins, right? Now we have to enforce it. Now we have to enforce it in every restaurant, in every shop. And so, it's like Brown v. Board. Schools did not suddenly integrate, and that's another story because they're not integrated now. But you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. Were there specific tactics that you think might work? I know you write about worker-led inspections. Is that something we should be looking at?
Well, worker-led inspections, a lot of these groups that I organized feel are the wave of the future, right? They're the only way you find out what conditions are really there, because workers won't talk to an inspector sent by the boss because they think they'll lose their job, right? And they won't talk about sexual harassment or assault because they're too embarrassed. But if you have another worker come in and you have, someone from the union come in with that worker, then people talk and you get an accurate description of labor conditions, and they improve. Right? Ben and Jerry's, which dragged their feet for years before they finally signed on to this worker-led inspection proposal, admitted, even when they weren't signing on, that that's the way conditions improve, was through that method.
Okay. I just had one other thing, and then we can go to audience questions. Okay. So you mentioned a worker who was living in her car.
Yeah.
I can imagine, even with wage increases, we're not immediately going to see all hourly workers able to afford housing, particularly in expensive cities like Seattle.
Right.
So did you get any sense of interaction or solidarity between housing affordability movements and labor movements? Is there any hope that separate but affiliated issue will get any better with this movement?
Yeah, a lot of the people that I talked to were involved in organizing around community benefits agreements, right? And this idea that you harness the frenzy around real estate development in cities like Seattle, New York, San Francisco, and the city government, after they've been lobbied, right, by these community groups and workers groups, makes an agreement with the developer, because the developer always wants some kind of concession. And the agreement is you build affordable housing, along with it, and not just token affordable housing, but, make significant investments in the neighborhoods. Some have worked better than others. Los Angeles, because the idea came from Los Angeles, has the widest array of these successful projects, but they're all over. And they're also organizing around healthcare, right? Because privatization around the world has diminished people's access to healthcare. And so it's and education. Right, I've seen peer education and people pooling their funds to make sure that there's some kind of education for workers in these movements. So they're very holistic. Housing affordability, healthcare affordability, and education affordability are very much part of these struggles.
Okay.
So we do have about 15 minutes for audience questions. If folks have questions, please, if possible, come up to the microphone so we can all hear you. We'll get through as many as we can, and please try to keep your questions in the form of a question. Thank you.
I want to ask about transportable benefits.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, there was a conference over at Seattle University, and there were people there from Uber and Uber workers who were anti-union and ones who were pro-union,
right,
from the Teamsters. And the surprising thing was that even this older woman who was saying all these wonderful things about Uber and how much they've improved. She says, yeah, transportable benefits, that would make sense. And these companies that spend, billions of dollars on complicated algorithms simply can't seem to figure out like long division that would allow them to pay, a pension and health insurance for no matter how many hours or minutes you work. But I'm wondering, some unions are not completely on board with that. What do you think about transportable benefits?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the people that I talk to are working for universal healthcare so that the issue of transportable benefits is not, so that healthcare is not tied to work. That said, obviously there needs to be some kind of organizing around fractional, because if you're a contract worker and you're not entitled to, the benefits that a full-time employee is, some kind of idea that your pension and your healthcare benefits can be one at least scaled up based on on organizing and on contract, and that's only going to be done through contract. I spoke to someone, right, many people who are kept intentionally below the benefits level, and that's what the whole idea is for this kind of hiring. So yeah, it's important. It's essential, really.
So this is really great to hear about the food service workers and people working hotels. I'm just kind of curious about what your take is on public service unions that are happening now. It seems like there's a lot of it's there's an assault, let's say, on teachers' unions, and even though there's some great things happening in Arizona and Oklahoma, there's still some things in the background. Legislatures that are taking away pensions and replacing good pensions with 30% or 401ks and things like that. So it's great to be optimistic, but it seems like our public service unions, who have been around for a while and are the backbone of what's still around, are really still taking it hard by a lot of from a lot of different directions.
Oh yeah, I mean it's a concerted effort to destroy the public sector unions, on the part of Republican governors and state houses, and sometimes Democratic ones, like in Rhode Island. And that's because they're the last. They were the last stronghold of labor in the United States, and they are under assault everywhere. I was involved with state workers in Concord, New Hampshire, a few weeks ago in their march to the State House, because they're being kept without a contract intentionally, right, with the hope that they will, they'll stop trying to negotiate it, or people will quit and they can de-unionize. So yeah, I mean, I think public sector unions at this point are the backbone of the labor movement in the United States. And the teachers' strike movement is really interesting because it's very much in the frame that I talk about here. It is a woman-led movement, right, by people who are protesting privatization of public services and, the destruction of livable wage scale. And, I think we're seeing private businesses do it, but I think the public sector unions are interesting too, because they sometimes bring together more conservative unions like firefighters and police with more radical unions like teachers and nurses, and so it creates, a pretty important coalition, I think.
Thank you.
If no one else will do it, I want to pose the pessimist perspective.
Be the pessimist.
Which you promised that you said you had some friends here in the audience who maybe are shy to frame it, but but it does seem like a lot of the positive movement that you cover is a response to a rollback. The returning to 100 years ago, particularly in the United States. Yeah. Is that a necessary push-pull in this dynamic? Do you think that do you think it's one step forward or two steps back, or is it two steps forward and one step back?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I think the fact that wages budged in the fall of 2016 and actually rose for the first time in 40 years is important to note in and of itself. While I was writing the book, I certainly got very depressed, and I usually get very depressed at some point in all my activist histories because the battle is so hard and because the costs are so great. These people are losing their jobs, although, as they say, in a way there's nothing to lose because they're earning so little anyway. Jenny Mills became homeless when she was employed, and she was one of 3 homeless employees in her one Walmart, right? So you can be a full-time employee and still not have enough to afford to pay, in this case in Southern California, outside of LA. So I think that the psychological benefits are huge. And that's what LaFonza Butler said when LA County and City and then the state of California passed the $15 wage. She said, nobody's going to Vegas on $15 an hour. It's $31,000 a year, even if you work full time, right? But she said people felt strangled by the lack of hope, right? And so hope and respect really matter. The one thing I didn't talk about is the word respect is everywhere. Organization United for Respect at Walmart, the RESPECT Fast Food Workers Alliance in Manila. Everybody I talked to a Walmart leader who led a ride for respect of Walmart, picking up Walmart workers across the country and going to Bentonville to corporate headquarters where they were met by dogs and police, right? And not let in to the headquarters of the company where they worked. And she said what really struck her was that people were hungry, but the first, second, and third thing they wanted to talk about was respect, right? Not being abused. Not being spoken to as if they were disposable and as if they were stupid and, being called stupid in front of customers. So the benefits are many. And I think 3 weeks after the Trump election, to come back to that question, when they staged civil disobedience actions in 300 American cities, that broke the paralysis. Right? People went out and got themselves arrested, and they slowed down airports, and they walked into legislatures, and they felt like, okay, I can go on another day. So can I measure it? No. But I will remain the optimist because that's who I am and because these people were incredibly inspiring and they genuinely made me feel better in the aftermath of the election.
I wonder if you've got any a take on what's happening in the other side, because in Seattle, they voted city council voted in the $15 an hour raise, which isn't what happened at the airport. That was an initiative, right? But the mayor got this panel together, and it was all these billionaires and different people. And, there's this one guy I remember who was a venture capitalist. He's very progressive, actually. And so he said that, he talked to a lot of the other movers and shakers and just said, look, it's coming. We better do something to get on the boat. Otherwise, it's not going to go the way you want it to, right? But, I think this big austerity movement that's happening, it's happened for a long time. And there's a lot of these billionaires, they feel entitled to it. They think that they actually earned that money, which they didn't. The people who you're talking about are the ones that earned the money. So, but there is also people that maybe think, maybe we overstepped, maybe they're going to start wheeling out the guillotines here, So did you get any kind of perspective on that yourself?
I mean, there's tremendous pushback, right? The Koch network, the American Legislative Exchange Council, introduced right-to-work bills and preemption bills that said that, cities could not have higher wages than states 1,000 times into state legislatures in, just in the 2010s, right? So that there's totally pushback, and there are many defeats, right? The reason the Providence workers that I spoke to went on hunger strike on the steps of the state capitol was because they'd organized in Providence. The city council was going to pass the $15 wage, or it would pass on the ballot, and the state preempted it. They voted to preempt it because of money from the hotel industry and the restaurant industry, and so they then went back and organized the union. I think change is always 2 steps back and 1 step forward. In this case, it's 100 years back and having to fight for rights that we thought were won in the New Deal.
So 2 things come to mind when I was talking about this. What kind of effort is, you talked about the successfulness of boycotts of big companies, of boycotts, of basically using the average everyday consumer. What kind of resources there are for consumers to try to figure out who is making the goods and what kind of movement is being made to publicize that? That's question 1.
Okay.
Totally different, separate thing. Most of this is discussion about corporate entities, but an enormous amount of employment is by small independent businesses. What are your thoughts about that? So those are my 2.
So I'll answer the second one first because it's often asked and is the most troubling to people, right? Small businesses give our cities character. It's, small farms feed most of the world. If you have to pay people a $15 wage, will they survive? Anecdotally, in Seattle, in Los Angeles, in Providence, in many places where people are being paid the $15 wage, we're not seeing a whole lot of pushback from small businesses. We're seeing a little, but most of the pushback is from these big corporations. And in fact, some small businesses have signed on to the $15 wage. And in Long Beach, California, they passed it because 150 small businesses went and lobbied and said, this is better for us. Because when more people have more money in their pockets, they spend it, and they spend it in our stores, right? And they're the people we know in our communities. So I think for small businesses, it's a convenient kind of idea that it's going to hurt them. And so far, it doesn't seem to have, although I know there's the UW study, and there can be some argument about that, and maybe people have different opinions here. I don't know, maybe you do. The other issue is consumers, and I think consumers have been crucial. And so one big victory is the Altagracia project in the Dominican Republic, which makes now college logo wear for 800 colleges and universities across the United States. And they were a place where there were overseas investors, the usual thing. When the corporation, the plants finally unionized, they just shut down and left and went someplace where it wasn't unionized. And this guy, Phil Knight of Knight's Apparel, who was in North Carolina, who was a clothing maker who'd gone through some personal awful things in his life, said, let's make an experiment, right? Consumers have been saying they want this, they want clothing made in a humane way. What if we try? And so they opened the Villa Altagracia project in the Dominican Republic, unionized from the start, providing health care from the start, and a housing fund so workers could move into houses with running water and electricity, which a lot of them didn't have before this. And then consumers and corporations together, consumers on college campuses and in cities demanded this. Students demanded it from their college administrations. And you had corporate responsibility too, not only Knight's Apparel, but Barnes & Noble, which owns most of the college bookstores in the country now, really pushed it. They wanted to distribute this kind of clothing, so the Villa Altagracia label can be found in college and university bookstores across the country. Clean Clothes Campaign, United Students Against Sweatshops are the two ones that wherever I went, two consumer groups, wherever I went, like regular garment workers knew them, right, and felt like they were on their side and they'd made a difference. So I think consumer boycotts really, really, really matter, and we're seeing it in Portland now with the Burgerville boycott. Will it have an impact? We'll find out. But I think consumers are one of the pieces, along with responsible corporations, flexible unions, and then obviously this grassroots uprising, and government. City laws, county laws, state laws, all of it is easier to move now than the federal level for obvious reasons.
Okay, I feel a little bit more optimistic.
Oh, good.
Annelise Orleck, thank you so much.
Yes,
thank you, Heidi Groover. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
Let me be the first to welcome you. It must have been so hard to leave your homeland. I can't begin to understand the trouble you've been through. Just let me be the first to welcome you. Many dreamers came this way before, a long unbroken line, and each one hoped to find the peace and freedom they were longing for. And everyone comes from somewhere, everyone comes from somewhere, whether near or far. I am the son of an immigrant. My ancestors sailed across the sea.